Good afternoon. Let's start Lecture 13, our final lecture of the course, the Sufficiently General Theory of Governance. Let's start with the questions that have accumulated over the past time. Question. This year it will be 3 years of my total cessation of alcohol. What comes after this period and how could it be interrupted? For example, by the dose which is in kefir, fermented or sweet foods. The refusal itself was motivated by a lecture on the conception by K.P. Petrov, if I'm not mistaken, where he said that under the influence of alcohol, intuition is drowned out for 3 years. Thank you in advance. Well, this is a somewhat inaccurate transfer of the meaning set forth in the conception. What is the essence of this? If you look at the pictures on the internet, then you can find what erythrocytes, red blood cells, look like. If the level of alcohol in the blood has exceeded a certain critical level. The fact is that the erythrocyte carries a fatty membrane on itself. Moreover, the erythrocyte carries a negative electrical charge. By strength of these two circumstances, erythrocytes are repulsed normally from each other by electrostatic forces. Well, and even if they touch, the fatty membrane is a kind of lubricant, and they each act separately. And in the brain, we have very thin capillaries, which are so thin that when even a single erythrocyte squeezes through it, it pushes its walls apart. At the same time, there is a kind of massage of the circulatory system from inside the vessels. And you see, the carrier of the psyche is factually the human biofield, and the brain is a material instrument for supporting the biofield and interacting with it. If we introduce alcohol into the organism in such quantities that the fatty membranes are washed off from the erythrocytes, then the erythrocytes begin to stick together. As a result, they form bunches that look like bunches of grapes. In the end, it turns out that such a bunch cannot squeeze into those vessels, capillaries, into which one erythrocyte could squeeze. And further, there begins the death of neural fields. As a result of the death of neurons, regardless of what ideas about higher nervous activity, the functioning of the human psyche one relies on. Regardless of these ideas, a violation of various informational algorithmic interconnections occurs in the process of functioning of the psyche. Further, simply an analogy. Now you can make some images with an extremely high resolution on your computer. There will be many megabytes, many pixels, or you can open this image in a graphics editor and significantly reduce its size on account of the fact that the number of pixels will be reduced by many times. As a result, those details that were visible in the first original image they will no longer be visible in the simplified, reduced in volume image. This is a real fact. And then it turns out that the world view, as a system of image representations of a person about the world, it solves a very simple task. Functionally simple, but not simple in its essence. modeling the course of events in a preemptive mode in relation to the real flow.
Непростенькую по своей сути. Моделирование течения событий в упреждающем реальное течение режиме.
And when we act in the world, then we correlate the flow of senses with the model of the world that we have. If there is nothing in the model of the world, then we have problems with interpreting what the senses bring. Well, here is one such example. In the Indian descriptions of the arrival of the Spaniards in America, there are no ships, because in the languages of the Indians, there was no such concept, and they interpreted the ships somehow differently. Look from the other side. If you look at the Concorde, a supersonic airliner, or at the TU-144 from the front, and look at some images of the Serpent Garinich when viewed from behind, you will see some similarities. And if you look at these planes from the tail and at the Serpent Garinich from the front, then you will also see some similarities. And in fact, if you want, take it as a joke, if you want, take it seriously. But if in the language there was no concept of airplane, and when someone saw an airplane, then he had to somehow describe it in the terminology that was characteristic of the era. And then, a jet-powered plane would be described as a fire-breathing Serpent Garinich. But one must understand that such the so-called Serpent Garinich flew, not flapping its wings and its muzzles. It flew forward, having arranged itself into a kind of aerodynamic configuration with its tail forward on jet thrust. In one of the series of the cartoon, Well, Just You Wait, a Serpent Garinich is shown flying with its tail forward on jet thrust. Why am I saying all this? Because if in our world understanding, in our world view, some detailedness is lost, then those spheres of activity that require modeling with a certain detailedness of processes, those spheres of activity that require correlating the flow of senses with a certain detailedness that is in the inner picture of the world, they become closed to us. And the practice of many people shows that if we touch on questions of alcohol consumption, then the whole thing looks like this. Within 24 hours, a traffic cop with a breathalyzer can detect that you drank alcohol in the amount of about a glass of dry wine, a glass of champagne for the new year. But if the traffic cop doesn't stop you within this time, then by chemical traces, the pathologist will be able to detect alcohol in your blood within about a week after you drank. Further, independently of each other, psychologists report a decrease in IQ within about 3 weeks after drinking a glass of dry wine. Neurophysiologists taking brain encephalograms by their character within about 3 weeks can also say that alcohol was consumed in an amount of about 200 grams of dry wine. And then questions arise about higher nervous activity, which is tied to extrasensory perception, intuitive epiphanies, the work of the intellect at the limit of its capabilities. If we talk about this sphere, then the consequences of drinking a glass of dry wine, a New Year's glass of champagne, they will manifest themselves in the course of about 2.5, 3 years. And if we talk about the detailedness of the picture of the world, which exists somewhere in there in the depths of our psyche, then it is really restored after 2.5, 3 years after a person enters the mode of absolute sobriety, on condition that these 2.5, 3 years he really worked at the limit of his psyche, developed personally. Then functionality is restored. Therefore, after these 3 years have passed, new possibilities should open up for the person, which 3 years ago were closed to him, simply by virtue of the fact that his organism was not able to realize them. Well, then the question is whether the person will realize these possibilities or they will remain unsought out. Next question. People have situations where they start thinking a lot about something alone. If there is no one with whom to talk about this, then how can they come to the right decision? That is, how can they come to the right decision alone? You see, there are two different things that can be named with the same words. Thinking alone and tormenting oneself with thoughts. In fact, tormenting oneself with thoughts, this is a rather heavy and destructive process, because if the person torments himself with thoughts, then this in principle is up to the point of total exhaustion or loss of strength. Well, this can be provided by anything: oncology, heart attacks, strokes, and simply the seemingly cause-free death of the entire extinguishing of the organism. But these are the most severe cases. Tormenting oneself with thoughts, this means one gets stuck in a kind of hopeless cyclics of processing information related to one and the same theme. This is a destructive process and one should not allow this to happen. If you fall into such a thing, then you need to, with all your effort, by volitional order, suppress such a mess in your head and engage in something different. Well, first you need to restore the emotion-meaning structure. But thinking alone, including when there is no one with whom to talk among people, this is somewhat different, because thinking alone can also be done in different ways. You can, withdrawing into yourself, relaxing, pose questions to the unconscious levels of the psyche, and after that, without bothering yourself, without burdening yourself with all sorts of informational noises, such as mass media, entertainment, movies, and so on and so forth, simply wait until in quiet clarity the answer to these questions emerges. The second variant of thinking alone stems from the fact that being alone is an illusion, because you can always turn to God with any questions. And if in the previous period you were not so sinful that the Almighty put you in His allowance, then you will receive an answer to these questions.
греховных
How you get
людей
it is
предоставить
another
всем
question
этим
because
отпущению
there are many
человека,
variants.
то вы получите ответ на эти вопросы.
The answers to these questions can
Как
emerge both when
получите,
you are
это
awake
другой
or
вопрос,
asleep
потому что
from the
бывает
unconscious levels of the
много
psyche,
ответы на эти
either in a direct
вопросы
form
могут
or in
всплыть
some kind of
не
metaphorical,
во
allegorical
сне
form.
с бессознательных уровней психики, либо
Well,
в
there may be
сознательном,
other
либо в
variants.
какой-то
When in your
метафорической,
hands, by chance,
настоятельной. Ну а могут быть
you will have a
и другие
text that
варианты,
contains either
когда
answers to these
в
questions
ваших руках
or
случайно
hints of where and
окажется
how you can
текст,
get the
который
correct answers.
содержит либо ответы на эти вопросы, либо намеки, откуда
Either you will
и
find
какие
yourself in
ответы
communication with a
правильные
person
ответы,
who will
либо
either give answers to these
познакомитесь
questions
с человеком, который либо
or will
даст
give you
ответы на
something
эти
that will
вопросы,
enable
либо
you to later,
даст вам
independently,
что-то, что
get answers to
позволит
these
вам
questions.
впоследствии самостоятельно получить ответы на
Well,
эти
in general,
вопросы.
it all
Ну,
comes
в
down to the
общем-то,
main
все
thing,
сводится
how to
к
come to the right
как
decision
в
alone.
одиночку прийти к правильному решению. Первый том
The
основ
first volume of the
социологии,
fundamentals
как
of
работает
sociology,
личностный
how the
интеллект.
psyche of personality
Главное
works.
создать
The main
настроение.
thing is to create a mood.
Второе перейти от я-центричного
The second
миропонимания
is to move from the
мозаичного
I-centric world
мироощущения
understanding
на
to the
основе
mosaic
единства
God
материи
initial one,
информации мира.
the
Ну и
basis
дальше
of the
следить за
triunity
тем,
of matter
что
information
делает
measure.
ваш интеллект на
Well, and
самом
further,
деле, и что
you
он
need to
должен
monitor what
делать.
your intellect is actually doing and what it
Следующий
should do.
вопрос.
Next question.
Как быть, если
What do you
объяснить
have to
людям
do
типы
after you
психики,
explained to
виды
people the
власти,
types of
настроения,
psyche,
толпы или
types of power,
поведения
and the structure of a crowd elite society,
общества? А они,
but on the
наоборот,
contrary,
выражают
they
симпатию
express
такому
preferences for such
обществу,
a society
согласны
and
жить по
agree to
его
live by its
законам,
laws.
готовы терпеть
They are
лишения
ready
ради
to endure the
выгоды и
hardships
есть
and
надежда,
power
что
of other
потом
people
сами
with the
сядут
hope
в
that
кресло
later
начальника
they
и
will sit in the
возьмут
chair of the
все
boss
целиком.
and then get it all back in
Стоит ли
full.
работать в таком
Is it
обществе
worth
или
working
лучше
in such a
уйти,
society, or is
чтобы
it
они
better to
сами
leave
варились
them,
в своей
so that they
каше?
themselves cook in
Если
their own porridge?
предложение остаться,
If the offer is to
значит ли
stay,
это, что я
does that
могу
mean that I can
использовать их
exploit their
слабости
weakness
и
and manipulate them
манипулировать ими
according
по
to my
своему
discretion?
произволу? Когда
When you start
начинаешь
talking
им
to them
говорить
about
про
nraviousness and
нравственность и
soulvest,
совесть, все
everyone
смеются и
laughs and jokes in
получают в
answer.
ответ
They do
«не
not want to
желаю
change.
меняться».
Yes, there
Да,
are
есть
such
и
people.
такие люди. Вот, некоторые из
Some of
них
them are
удовлетворены
satisfied with their
своим
status.
статусом. Ну, один вот из моих
Well, one of
знакомых
my
прямо
acquaintances
сказал,
said
что
bluntly
он
that
понял, что
he
он
realized that
демон, и
he
в
was a
этом
demon,
положении
and he was
вполне
quite happy with
устроен.
the situation.
Вот. Другие не удовлетворены
Others are not
статусом,
satisfied with their
вот,
status in
другие
society,
надеются,
and they
что
hope that
когда-нибудь
someday
они достигнут более
they will achieve a
высокого
higher
статуса
status position,
положения,
and
и
then,
тогда
indeed,
действительно
will
будут
be incredibly
несказанно
happy.
счастливы. Но
But
практика
practice shows
показывает,
that
что
most of them live
большинство
with the
из них
syndrome of
живут
the old
синдромом
woman from the
старухи из
tale of A.S.
сказки
Pushkin,
Пушкина, и никакой
and no career
карьерный
growth will
рост
ever satisfy their
никогда не
vanity.
удовлетворит их тщеславие. Поэтому
Therefore, after you
после
have
того,
explained
как
everything and
вы
made
все
sure that they
объяснили
understood
и убедились в
adequately,
том, что они
you can
поняли
leave them to
адекватно,
themselves and the flow of circumstances,
вы можете
so
предоставить
that they
их самим
personally
себе
experience
по
how
типу
right they are
обстоятельств,
and what will
либо
come of
они
it.
на личном опыте
Usually
прочувствуют,
nothing good will come
насколько
of it
они
for
правы,
them. It will
что
not
из
work,
этого получится. Обычно ничего хорошего для них не получится. Не
because while a
получится
person
потому,
has
что
not consciously
пока
comprehended
человек
something,
не знал чего-то, то свыше
then from
его
above he is
охраняет
protected from the negative consequences of
негативных
ignorance.
последствий незнания, ну, по крайней мере,
Well, at
тех
least in those
случаев,
cases
когда
where he
он
really strives for
стремится
personal
к
development.
личностному развитию. А вот после того, как его
But after he is
уведомили,
notified of something,
то вместе с
then along with the
информацией,
information he receives,
которую он
he
получил,
accepts.
он
Well, let's say it like
принимает,
this,
ну, скажем так,
does not
даже не
even
принимает.
accept.
Если он даже не
If he does not
принимает
accept
ответственность за
responsibility
себя,
unto himself,
то
then
ответственность
responsibility
за
for the
последствия
consequences of
его
his actions
действий
is put
возлагается
on
на
him.
него, потому
because the information that allows him to behave correctly in the stream of providence is provided to him. And accordingly, he has everything in order to behave correctly, but not the way he is used to. If he continues to behave the way he is used to, then the feedback lines enclose, which restrain his activity to the point that he, prematurely, in relation to the biological resource of his organism, leaves this world. As for the question of manipulating such people according to your discretion, yes, such a possibility opens up. But such a possibility is realized outside of Christian ethics, because Christian ethics is characterized by the fact that the main principle in it is refusal to exploit God's allowance in anyone's interests in relation to anyone else. And if we begin to solve certain tasks by manipulating others as zombies, then we thereby drop out of Christian ethics and find ourselves close to Voland from the Master and Margarita, because the meaning of his conversation with Berlioz and Bezdomny, well, this is a question of evaluating God's allowance in relation to them in order to exploit allowance in his own interests. So this is all that can be said about the question of manipulation. But indeed there are many things that you cannot do in the place of another person. Something the person is obliged to do himself. Well, one such illustrative example of this is the destiny of Judas. Because one cannot say that Christ was undiscerning as a psychologist, that he was ineffective as a teacher. But if Judas did what he did, then this is an indicator that this was pearls before swine. Judas did not do something that he should have done in order to behave differently. And no one in the world and outside of this world could have done this instead of Judas himself. He was supposed to do it. And this principle applies in fact to all people in all eras. There is always something in the destiny of every person that this person must do himself, and no one, never, in any way, will do it in his place. Because everything that concerns personal development is the result of the purpose-oriented efforts of the person himself. It is impossible to pull him out of something. It is impossible to push him somewhere. The person must develop himself. Further, next question. Why does the global predictor exclude the possibility of life on the planet together? This question remained unanswered because the answer was given in the sense that the global predictor is the devil. Will they harm man everywhere and always? Why? Well, we can't understand this. This is a different psyche. The answer is ivorology. Only when reading, you should put aside the extremism of the author. The global predictor not only has a different psyche, but also blue blood, which differs from the red blood of a goyim by the presence of hemocyanin, the molecule of which has the shape of the Star of David. And this means that on our planet with a huge amount of oxygen, they need to eat the blood and flesh of the red-blooded for survival, and also purpose-orientedly reduce the level of oxygen on the planet, which they have been doing since they settled on the planet 5,778 years ago, according to the Jewish calendar. It was not about the fact that Iblis, the devil or someone else, is corporeal, and he has a different physiology and anatomy. It was about the fact that there are field life forms that do not have a bodily organism, and accordingly do not have any bodily anatomy and physiology. But everything that concerns what is happening on the earth, in the interests of the global predictor, you can call it ivorology, you can call it something else. But this is a periphery. It is not independent. Well, as far as the question of concentration of oxygen is concerned, this is a debatable question, because what concentration of oxygen is normal for man? And is Earth the homeland of man, or is some other planet the homeland of man? This is a debatable question. But really, now the Earth is our home. If man is placed in an overly oxygenated atmosphere, then, as it is known from medicine, this will provoke pneumonia and death. Therefore, what is the norm, what is not, this is a separate theme. Moreover, there is such a view that the current biosphere, this is the remnants of the past biosphere, which perished in one of the global catastrophes. That normal forests were represented by such giant trees as sequoia, and our current forests are the undergrown forests of the ancient biosphere, and that the mass of the present biosphere is about 20,000 times less than the mass of the biosphere of the one that perished as a result of the catastrophe. Therefore, what is the norm for man? What is not the norm for man? These are debatable questions. So far, our biosphere accepts us all, regardless of what and how. How will the global historical process develop further? How will it affect the biosphere? This depends on all of us. Well, if you do nothing, then the current civilization is really going along the path of the destruction of the current biosphere. But then the question arises that if the biosphere collapses, will there be a place in the future biosphere for someone else? Red-blooded, blue-blooded, green-blooded, and someone else. Next question. Could you give an example of the entire function of governance in the supersystem using a past event, indicating it step by step, objective, stability in terms of predictability, and so on? Well, look at history from the position of the sufficiently general theory of governance, and you will see a lot. Look at the work, Times of Trouble in Rus, Origin, Course, Overcoming. It shows the cyclics of the history of Rus. The total cycle includes two phases. The first phase begins after the catastrophe. Its essence is an attempt to build an all-people state. At the end of the first phase, an elite appears which does not need an all-people state. It arranges a coup d'etat, builds an elite corporative state. Further, the elite corporative state violates the people as much as it can. But by strength of biological degeneration and social-cultural degradation of the elite leads the country to another catastrophe. And again, the new cycle of history begins with an attempt to build an all-people state. The last collapse of the elite corporative state took place in 1917. Look at our works, which are devoted to what took place there, how the events developed, and you will see a multitude of entire functions of governance with which the actions of different subjects were connected. Because the monarchists worked for one entire function of governance, the liberals worked for another entire function of governance, the Marxists worked for a third entire function of governance, and the Bolsheviks, as part of the Marxists, worked for a fourth entire function of governance. The whole thing was intertwined in history. Often in the same events, one and the same person worked for one function of governance and for another function of governance without even realizing their conflict. Therefore, I will not give examples, read dehermetization, read the analytical notes dedicated to the centenary of the Great October Socialist Revolution. Well, the penultimate note on the theme, the next tasks of the Soviet power and society, and the possibilities of their solution, objective and subjectively conditioned. There is also a lot about it there. Next question. What is the difference between the sense of measure and the sense of совесть? The sense of measure is in itself nravless. That is, the sense of measure. This is the sense of the matrix of possibilities. The entire set of possibilities, all the possibilities of transition from one state to another, and so on. It is in itself obviously not... Well, I don't want to say it's not conditioned, because distinction that is obviously conditioned also operates in it. But nevertheless, it gives the perception of the matrix in as much detail as the development of this sense in the individual allows. But of all the possibilities that are objectively present in the world, some of the possibilities lie in the stream of God's allowance. Совесть imposes a ban on the implementation of such possibilities. It obliges one to realize the possibilities that can be realized within the boundaries of God's glorious providence. The next question is about the noosphere. By what is the introduction of the concept noosphere into the conception of social safety conditioned? The concept of the noosphere is introduced into the conception of social safety because the noosphere objectively exists. It is a part of the reality in which we live. If you perceive reality and relate to it meaningfully, then sooner or later you come to the fact that the noosphere exists. Question. From what sources can one read about the facts and manifestations of the influence of the noosphere? You can read Terra Deschardins, you can read V.I. Vernadsky, which presented their own conception of the noosphere in their own way. These conceptions are different. In addition, if we analyze the course of history, then we can also see that many processes that man, it seems, did not govern, but they somehow themselves proceeded in the historical past in such a way that what we perceive as villainy suffered defeat.
Кроме
What
того,
is more,
такие факты,
facts such
как
as the description of the sinking of the
Титаник
Titanic
14
14 years
века,
before the catastrophe
это тоже
are also certain noospheric
некие
manifestations.
ноосферные проявления. Ну, одно из последних
One of the last such
ноосферных
noospheric
проявлений
manifestations
это
is the events
событие
of the day before yesterday,
позавчерашнее,
when there was an
когда
attempt on the life of I.E. Repin's picture,
было
Ivan the
покушение
Terrible
на
and his son
Репина,
Ivan.
Иван Грозный и сын его Иван.
You see, the fact of the
Понимаете,
murder
факт
of Ivan
убийства
Ivanovich by Ivan Vasilievich,
Ивана Ивановича Иваном Васильевичем, он в
it in
общем-то в
fact
русских
does not find
источниках
reliable
нет
confirmation in Russian sources.
достоверного подтверждения. А то, что Запад всегда
And that the West has
клеветал на
always
Россию,
slandered
это
Russia,
факт.
this is a fact. The
История
history of the reign of
царствования
Ivan the
Ивана
Terrible was
Грозного,
pondered on by the
она
elite,
осмыслялась элитой. А
but
с
from the point
точки
of view of the
зрения
governing
правящей
elite,
элиты,
Ivan
Иван
the Terrible had no
Грозный
right
имел
to the
право на
throne,
престол и,
and
соответственно,
accordingly,
как
as an upstart,
выскочка,
as illegitimately
как
born,
незаконно
but not in the
рожденный
sense
не
that
в
his
том
mother
смысле,
cheated on his
что
father,
его мать изменила отцу, а в том
but in the
смысле,
sense
что
that Vasily III did not
третий
have the
не имел
right to marry
права
Елена Glinskaya,
на брак с Еленой Глинской, потому что церковь
because
была
the church was
против
against
этого, и
it,
для того,
and
чтобы
in order to
жениться на
marry
ней,
Елena Glinskaya,
он
he exiled
сослался на
Solomonia Saburova to a monastery.
Эпоха представлена
The era is
фактологией
represented by
и
factology and the
осмыслением
processing of
фактологии
factology
теми,
by
кто
those who came
наследовал
after those who carried out the coup d'etat, as a result
тем,
of
кто
which the Romanov
совершил
dynasty
государственный
began to
переворот,
reign.
в результате которого воцарилась династия Романовых. А
And
если
if we turn to
обратиться к
folklore,
народному фольклору,
then
то
the sources show
источники
that in the
показывают,
19th
что в
century
XIX
there was not a
веке
single
не
statement in
было в
folklore
народном
in which
фольклоре
Ivan the Terrible was
зафиксировано ни
characterized poorly.
одного высказывания, в котором бы Иван Грозный характеризовался плохо. Поэтому,
Therefore,
если
if the picture of I.E.
картина
Repin
носит
is slanderous in
мифический
relation to Russian
характер по
history,
отношению к русской истории,
then
то
the attempt on it is
покушение
quite
на
natural,
нее вполне
especially since this is
закономерно,
not the
тем более,
first
что это не
attempt,
первое покушение. И,
and perhaps not the
возможно,
last
не
attempt,
последнее покушение. До той
until
поры,
such time as the
пока
history of the
история
era of Ivan the Terrible
эпохи Ивана
is presented in
Грозного
our
не будет
textbooks
представлена в
adequately,
наших
consonantly with
учебниках
itself.
адекватно,
Until then, such things can
сообразно самой
reoccur.
себе, до той поры такие вещи могут повторяться. Ну и также
Well, and
обратите
also pay
внимание,
attention,
мы
when
в
we were
детстве
kids,
с
we read
интересом
The Three
читали
Musketeers
трех
with
мушкетеров,
interest.
дальнейшие
The further
продолжения
continuation of the
сюжета.
plot
Это все
is
об
all about the
истории
history of
нации,
France.
фантазии. Потому что
Fantasies,
изучать историю
because
Франции
studying the
в
history of
эпоху
France of that era
мушкетеров
according to the Three
это несколько
Musketeers
не то, что
is somewhat not what one should
следует
do.
делать. И, в общем, вот это
And in general, this
несоответствие
non-correspondence of
сюжета
the plot
реальной
to real
истории, оно у
history
нас не
does not
вызывает
cause any
никаких
resistance in us.
сопротивлений. Хихи-ха-ха,
Hee hee
посмотрели,
ha ha, we
пора
watch. As time is
своим
time, let's
звуком
rejoice in
своих
our age by the
всяких и
beauty
так
and the
далее.
cup, and so on
Ну, а
and so
есть вот
forth.
повесть «Князь Серебряный», не
But here
самого
we have the
слабого,
story,
мягко
Prince of
говоря,
Silver,
русского писателя
by not the
Алексея
weakest, to put it mildly,
Константиновича
Russian
Толстого.
writer Alexei Konstantinovich
Его
Tolstoy.
нету в курсе школьной литературы, но тем не менее Толстого
The story is
многие
not in the
читали.
course of school literature, but
Ну, как
nevertheless,
восприятие
many have read A.K.
Толстого?
Tolstoy.
А никак.
Well, and how is the Prince of Silver perceived?
Ну, судя по всему, потому что
It is not really.
человек
Why?
русский
Well,
внутренне где-то
to all
в глубине
appearances,
души
because a Russian person
имеет
internally somewhere in the depths of his soul
представление, какая реальная история той
has an
эпохи.
idea of what the real history of
Когда
that
он
era
читает
was.
текст не тот, то этот текст не
And when he
вызывает у
reads the wrong
него
text,
отклика
then this text does not cause in him a response, desire to reread, desire to agree with the interpretation of the events by the author. It just goes into the past. Well, further concerning the work of I.E. Repin. You see, Repin indeed, in the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, was an authoritative not only artist, but also a social figure, thanks to the paintings he painted. Well, if we touch on some pictures of a social political character, then let's recall arrest of a propagandist, refusal of the confession, they did not expect him, then the jubilation of the people over the announcement of the manifesto on October the 17th, 1905. Well, further what? Further, 1917, the propagandists came to power. And where did Repin end up? Ilya Yefimovich Repin lived out his life in Finland. There was no way to lure him into Soviet Russia. Yes, he came to restore the painting, Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan, after the first attempt on the picture, and then he left for Finland again. So you see, in this, there is a certain element of dishonesty or self-delusion, because if you paint arrest of a propagandist, refusal of the confession, they did not expect him, you are encouraging a certain number of young people to follow this path. And you are obliged to bear responsibility for everything that will be as a result of your propaganda activities. And you are obliged to feel empathy with those mistakes, even your own mistakes, those mistakes into which you have involved others thanks to your authority. But this was not the case with him. Question. The questioner mentions the analytical note of 2010, prophetic and free is the Vatical word, which gives an example of the plane crash of Lech Kaczynski, in which the noosphere manifested itself in the quality of a fog. So the manifestation of the noosphere is the intervention of natural elements? Do I understand it right? Noospheric manifestations are not only the intervention of natural elements. Yes, natural elements are subordinated to the noosphere of the planet. But we are also a part of the noosphere, and the actions of people, both conscious and unconscious, in their totality, are also noospheric manifestations. Yes, they are obviously conditioned. Question. Is the noosphere a subject? Well, the question is open. Because, you see, there is sufficiently often the algorithmicness of activity. Algorithmicness of activity can be different. Its carrier can be a subject with a meaningful will, or maybe a certain automaton, including one with artificial intelligence, but without dobronraviousness and will. Therefore, what the noosphere is in the aspect of subjectness is an open question. So far, in any case, it is open. Question. AI Kalpakidi also hopes for the Chinese, recalling that it was during the Stalinist period that power passed to those who have it now. AI Fursov recalls the Suez Crisis, the Rothschild campaign in China to restore the influence of the British Empire, after which their ears began to be seen behind the Shanghai and Beijing clans. Although the author of the book, The Uncrowned Kings of Red China, says that there are many groups of interests, like dialects in China, AI Kalpakidi hopes for the arrival of aliens. By the way, does Mikhail Viktorovich wonder what to answer these aliens about the formation of their negative image in the film industry? But if one believes Girvitz, they have known about us for a long time and are fenced off with shields, so that what will strike the earth will not move towards them. This is in the movie The Silence of Dr. Evian. Well, what is the question? The author expressed a number of opinions about what AI Kalpakidi says in his understanding. He mentioned the film The Silence of Dr. Evian. A long time ago there was this quite interesting in terms of plot film. Well, and then what? Question. How is the speech of V.G. Zhdanov on economics evaluated? Next comes the link. It is not evaluated in any way. We are not engaged in evaluating. Question. To effectively carry a boss against the enemies of socialism, it will be necessary to annex Hollywood and most of the mass media, if not all. Well, pay attention to the verb to carry a boss against the enemies of socialism has been introduced. The verb comes from the old woman Caraboss from the tale of Sleeping Beauty, who harmed and harmed ineffectively. And the comrade wants to harm the opponents more effectively carabossing in relation to them, that is, creating certain matrix egregorial processes into which the enemy will be drawn. And, after that, he will have some damage. You see, this is the proposal to act in line with the algorithmics. Some evil-minded eat the fury of others. We don't need to caraboss. We need to exert such an impact so that they stop carabossing both in relation to themselves and in relation to us. Question. The thinnest line between a human and a demon is the ability to put love above instincts. Did I understand you correctly? Yes, you understood correctly, because a human is characterized by love, in the stream of which the manifestation of all other properties that are given to every individual from above, either upon the fact of birth or which he has worked out himself in life, find a place. Question. I ask my questions again. For some reason, the last time they were not answered. How, from the position of the sufficiently general theory of governance, can the problem with stray dogs be solved? I have such an impression that the problem was created on purpose. Indeed, in Soviet times, there were no such problems. Well, in Soviet times, people were different, and the dog was indeed a pet, and there were no wild dog populations. The problem was created, if not on purpose, then because of mass irresponsibility. Again, if you look at the nomenclature of breeds that were in the USSR and which are now, then in the USSR there were practically no toy dogs. The dogs were mostly service dogs, Well, and the mongrels which were,
Дворники какие были,
they too in general were
служебные
service
собаки
dogs.
были служебными собаками. И хозяева, ну, не
And the
считали
owners did not consider it right,
правильным,
perhaps without realizing
может
it,
быть, даже не
but simply by
осознавая,
virtue of psychological
сильно
inertia, to
психологически
create homeless animals. With
создавать
homeless animals, the situation is such that if one dog is thrown out,
С
then sooner or
бездомными
later
зверьми
it will
дело
die.
обстоит таким образом, что если выкидывается один пес, то он рано или поздно погибнет. Но если
But if a lot
выкидывается
are thrown
много,
out,
то
then a
формируется
population
популяция,
takes shape,
которая начинает
which begins to reproduce itself and lives its own
и
life.
живет своей жизнью. Поэтому проблему
Therefore, the
надо
problem must be
решать,
solved,
но
but this
эта
is not
проблема
only a
не
problem of
только
shooting stray
отстрела
dogs,
бездомных собак, право на
whether
этот
it's right to
отстрел,
shoot or not to
право на
shoot
этот
stray dogs,
отстрел,
to
стерилизацию
sterilize stray
бездомных
dogs.
собак.
The
Проблема в
problem
том,
is
чтобы
not to reproduce the
воспроизводить
population.
популяцию. То есть
That is, the
численность
number of these
этих
species should be
видов
meaningfully supported by
должна
humans.
поддерживаться осмысленно человеком. И
And the excessive
лишние
ones,
должны,
well, should be destroyed as you like,
уничтожаться.
whether it is humane or not.
Гуманные,
But
это
nevertheless, it is a
негуманные,
fact.
не это факт. Представления
Ideas
о
about
гуманизме,
humanism,
они
they are
разные.
different.
Следующий
Next
вопрос.
question.
Прошу привести
Please give an
пример
example of a vector
цели,
of
где цели
objectives,
связаны
where the
с
objectives are linked through objective laws, and the removal of one of them will result in the failure of the other.
Другой.
My attempt of an example.
Первая цель достичь
Objective.
физического и
1.
психического
To achieve the
здоровья
physical and mental
подрастающих
health of the younger
поколений.
generations.
Для этого
2.
внедрение
For
в
this,
школах
the introduction of the
собак
system by VP Bazarny into schools and kindergartens.
обеспечение притоков в
3.
школы мужчин и
Ensuring the influx of male
содержание
teachers into the school,
образовательных
changing the
программ
content of
методик,
educational programs and methodics when the teacher is a mentor and children study independently, helping each
Во
other.
всех СМИ, интернете
4.
пропаганда
In all
здорового
mass
образа
media,
жизни
on the internet,
вместо
there is a propaganda of a
здравого
healthy
образа
lifestyle
оттуда.
instead of the
В
muck that
родительской
flows from
среде
there.
распространение
5. In
достоверных
the parental
знаний о
environment, the
воздействии
dissemination of
наркотиков
reliable
на
knowledge about the
здоровье
impact of any
сотрудничества
drugs on their
следующего
health,
поколения.
children, and future
Создание
generations.
безопасных условий для
6.
отработки
Creation of
навыков
safe conditions for
генетической
boys to
программы
follow the genetic
безопасности.
program, Games with
Если
Danger.
отказаться, скажем, от
And if you
последней
abandon,
цели, то
say, the
первая
last
так и не
objective,
будет достигнута.
then the first will never be achieved.
Ну, на мой взгляд,
Well,
вот
in
этот
my
пример,
opinion, this
который
example suggested by the author of the
задал
question
вопрос,
is
очень
adequate.
сложный. Следующий вопрос.
Next
Почему в
question.
Библии Бог наложил запрет
Why in
на
the Bible
вкушение
did God
плодов
prohibit
с
eating
дерева
fruits from the
познания?
tree of
Для чего
knowledge?
тогда
For what
создан
then was
человек,
man
если не
created,
для
if not for the
познания мира и
cognition of the
самого
world
себя
and
как
himself as a
частного
part of a
индивида?
single whole?
Возможно, Библия
Perhaps the
лукавит
Bible
и
is
говорит
crafty
не
and is not talking
настоящего
about the
Бога.
real God?
Если это так,
If
то
so,
тогда Ева не
then
совершала
Eve
греха
did not
перед
commit a
Богом
sin
от
before God
первенства.
who
Какова
is.
тогда роль
And what is the
змеи
role
в
of the
этом
serpent
случае?
in this case?
Вот.
The Bible
Библия
is
не
not being
лукавит,
crafty.
Библия не
The Bible does
договаривает
not
этот
speak
вопрос.
fully on this question, because the
Потому что
process of
процесс
cognition can be
познания
different.
может быть разным. Ну вот простенькая
Well,
аналогия.
here's a
Маленький
simple analogy.
ребенок. И чего там
A small
забыл
child sees
дырки
2
на
holes in the wall.
скрепочке? А
He
дай-ка
puts
мы
in 2
туда
nails.
вставим 2
And then
гвоздика.
what? Well, then
Ну а
220
после
volts
того, как
and
2
some amperes
гвоздика
come out from the
вставлено,
holes,
из
the
дырочек
child is gone.
220 вольт и сколько-то там ампер. Ребенка нет. Ребенок
The
сам
child himself
проявляет
shows an interest in
интерес к
cognition,
познанию,
as a result of
результат
which the
чего
damage can be fatal.
ущерб может быть смертельным. Поэтому в Библии
Therefore, the Bible imposes a
налагается
prohibition
запрет
on
на
cognition,
познание,
but
но
this is
нету
accompanied by the
запрета
defaults on
на
cognition by
на
self-concoction.
познание по отсебятине. А
And
дальше в
further,
том
in
же
the same
самом
Old
Ветхом
Testament,
Завете, в
in the
примере
wisdom of Solomon,
Соломона, речь
it is
идет
said
о
that the
том,
Spirit
что
of God, the Spirit of
Дух
wisdom of
Божий,
God,
Дух
this is
премудрости
a source of
Божьей,
knowledge,
это
and man
источник
must live with
знаний,
it.
и с ним должен
But he will not
человек
interact with an
не
individual who is
взаимодействовать
enslaved
с
by sin.
видом, который порабощен грехом. То есть
That
познание,
is,
познание
cognition
есть.
and cognition, these are different things.
Одно познание безопасное, оно
One
протекает
cognition is
в
safe.
русле
It flows in
Божьего
the stream of
промысла
God's
по
providence,
Божьему
under
воле.
God's guidance.
Другое познание опасно
The other cognition is dangerous for the cognizing person himself, and for those around him, and for descendants, if it flows on the basis of self-concoctions, and the desire to assert himself as an outstanding scientist, Nobel laureate, or someone else. So the question is deep, but a default is inherent in it. Further, a question about Lecture 11, the potential vector of objectives from the point of view of the sufficiently general theory of governance, is an ideal. In relation to governance by the Almighty, the potential vector of objectives is one of the components of the vector of error of self-governance within the hierarchically highest all-encompassing governance. Is there no contradiction here? Well, maybe I spoke slightly inaccurately. The non-realizedness of the potential vector of objectives is a component of the current era of governance, because if ideals are embedded from above, then they must be realized. They are part of the vector of objectives of governance in the Almightiness. Question. In the lecture Weinmech, Methodology and Creativity of Cognition, you mentioned that the task of an individual is to assemble a kind of Rubik's Cube. Please tell us about the other facets, the connection between the worldview and world understanding, and how can the individual determine that the weight of the worldview is not false with the incoming flow of information? Please tell us about a peculiar universal component of potential. Tell us how to understand the expression from the basic textbook of the sufficiently general theory of governance when describing the two main methods of concentration of governance. However, the leader is doomed to perish after birth, since the generated by it structure concentrator, through which it impacts others, is informationally algorithmically enclosed also in relation to the leader itself. Let's start in order. Worldview is image understandings on the world. This is a model of the world that exists in the psyche of man. World understanding is an expression of the worldview in the lexicon of a certain language, either language in the generally accepted understanding, or some narrowly professional languages, including symbolic ones. Applied mathematics is a symbolic language that also describes the world in some way. In order for the world understanding to be adequate, it is necessary to exclude the principle that is known from the same. You may call me even a pot, just don't put me in the oven. Why should it be excluded? Because if something is called a pot, and it is not a pot in its essence, then the situation is inevitable, programmed in a probabilistically predetermined sense, when someone takes it and puts it in the oven. In order for everything to be safe, everything must be called by adequate to it names. And the accuracy of word usage is one of the elements of personal culture. Inaccuracies in the word usage in some situations are acceptable, and in some situations they inevitably entail errors in the activities of those who perceive the flow of words in written or spoken form. And in the fundamentals of sociology, the following metaphor was proposed. If the world understanding is correct, then it is like a Rubik's Cube. One facet is the worldview. Of course, it must be assembled correctly. The other facet is lexical forms.
И вот когда весь
And now, when the entire Rubik's Cube is created correctly, then our world understanding is correct. And the world understanding is the unity of the worldview and lexical forms.
Остальные грани в этой метафоре
The rest of the facets in this metaphor denote
обозначают
those connections between the elements of the worldview,
мировоззрения,
images, cartoons that are in the psyche,
и
and
языковыми
linguistic forms through which we explain the world to other people or try to understand what they tell us.
пытаемся понять то, что они нам говорят. Расскажите,
Question.
пожалуйста, о своеобразном
Please tell us about the peculiar and universal components of potential.
вопрос.
Well, the question is not entirely clear.
Ну, как
Well, how do I understand it?
универсальный это
Universal. This is what unites us all and allows us to communicate with each other.
а своеобразное
And a peculiar component of potential.
это то, что
This is what the Almighty offers us in the quality of unique features of our destiny.
нашей судьбы. И что из этого мы
And what from this we agree to accept as the meaning of our life.
смысл своей жизни.
Further, the question is about how to understand
фразу
the phrase from the preliminary materials of the training course that the leader is doomed to perish after birth, since the generated by its structure concentrator, through which it impacts others, is informationally algorithmically enclosed also in relation to the leader itself.
Речь идет о
This is about the concentration of governance in the supersystem by the method of destruction of the entire function of governance in the autonomous regions by way of creating a trans-regional center that carries out this concentration.
центра, который осуществляет эту концентрацию.
This kind of center does not arise in emptiness.
В пустоте.
It always arises in one of the regions.
Всегда в одном из регионов. А дальше
And then it turns out that after it arose and began to act, if looking at the world from its bell tower, then its region homeland,
регион Родина, он такой
well,
же регион, как
is the same region as all other regions, and it also should not have the ability to self-governance according to the entire function of governance.
полной функции. Ну а дальше посмотрите вот конкретно на историю.
Well, further, look concretely at history.
Был порожден
The biblical project was generated by the Jretz structures of ancient Egypt when the Jretzes degraded and became pseudo-Jretzes.
это проект построения,
This is a project of building a global system
в котором
in which slavery is carried out in relation to humanity in the name of God.
от имени Бога. Что дальше? Вот Египет
What's
породил
next?
этот проект, и после этого
So Egypt gave birth to this project,
была
and after that its statehood, which was governorially the most perfect among the statehoods known to history, simply degraded,
И в конце концов Египет стал колонией
and in the end,
Британии, Франции,
Egypt became a joint colony of Great Britain, France,
Британию,
since Great Britain was entrusted with the mission of implementing globalization in the framework of this project.
этого проекта. Это вот пример того, что
This is an example of the fact that a leader concentrator,
приходит к мысли,
when it comes
что
to the idea
концентрацию
that the concentration of governance in the supersystem must be carried out by way of destruction of governance according to the entire function in competing autonomous regions, eventually dies
в
itself.
конечном итоге сам. на здоровье.
Question.
Язык наш как объективный
Our
знак,
language as an objective given and as a culture of speech, the magic of the word, the objective reality of the magic of the word from the point of view of the lyricists, and the magic of the word from the point of view of physicists.
Тема рассмотрена в работе «Язык наш
Yes,
как
there is such a
объективной
thing.
данности, как культура».
The theme is considered in the work, our language as an objective given and as a culture of
Вопросы
speech.
закончились.
At this point, we are done with the questions. We now turn to a discussion of further themes related to the sufficiently general theory of governance.
Прошлый раз я
Last
просил
time,
вас
I asked you to watch
почитать
and yourselves understand
самостоятельно понять,
what
что
the method of
такое
dynamic programming is.
Вкратце он описан.
It is briefly described in the preliminary materials of the course, The Sufficiently General Theory of Governance.
Вкратце он описан.
It is briefly described in Fundamentals of Sociology in the second part, where the sufficiently general theory of governance is presented without the theory of supersystems.
Если вы заглянете на YouTube,
If you look on YouTube, there are many videos, lectures on the theme of the method of dynamic programming, which allows you to understand what is what.
который позволяет понять, что есть что. Но вот одна из
Well,
тем
one of the themes is how the method of dynamic programming is connected with
связана
life.
с жизнью, как в нем
How in
может
it is
выражаться
practically the entire theory of governance expressed.
вся теория управления. То есть его
That
можно
is,
рассматривать
this
как
method can be viewed
алгоритмическое выражение
as an algorithmic expression of the entire function of governance, everything that is touched upon in the course, the sufficiently general theory of governance.
Вот был такой
There is such a
рисунок.
picture in the sufficiently general theory of governance. How is it to be
Как его
understood?
понимать? А вот понимать его
It turns
оказывается
out that it's not possible to understand it if you have not mastered the mosaic worldview on the basis of the triunity of matter, information, measure.
материи, информации, мира. Если вы освоили
If you have mastered the triunity and you understand that the world in which we live, our organisms are a part of this world,
часть этого мира, и что
and that in every object that our psyche is able to single out in this world, there are three aspects of being.
присутствуют три аспекта
The material aspect is that which exists, which interacts with each other.
то, что взаимодействует друг с другом.
Matter, in all its possible aggregate states, solid, liquid, gaseous, plasma, when atoms lose their electron shells.
Плазма, когда атомы теряют электронные оболочки. Дальше
Further, physical fields, microparticles,
и в конце
and
концов
ultimately,
вакуум,
vacuum,
который
which is not emptiness,
не пустотой,
but one of the forms of organization of matter, one of the aggregate states.
состояний. В нашем понимании вакуум
In our understanding,
состояние,
vacuum
которое порождает
is the initial state that generates all other aggregate states of matter.
Но это дальше вопросы физики, в которые
Well, these are further questions of physics, which I do not like to delve into, because, in my understanding,
в понимании других
and in the understanding of other adherents of the conception of social safety,
правильных,
correct physics should be in a society with pravious nraviousness.
потому что если нравственность
Because if the nraviousness is not correct,
физика
physics is adequate, then people with the wrong nraviousness in the course of intraspecific competition can destroy more than one galaxy just for nothing in the exercise of self-affirmation.
Просто так, в порядке самоутверждения.
Two other aspects of being are related to measure:
Мирный,
a matrix of possible states of matter.
возможных состояний материи.
The matrix of possible states of matter and paths of transition of matter from one state to another sets, in fact, everything, all the possibilities of being, both on the scale of creation as a whole and on a smaller scale, within the boundaries of any smaller ones.
Каких-либо меньших. По отношению к материи,
In relation to matter, this is a matrix of possible states, and in relation to information, it is a system for coding information,
восприятие
because the perception of information without a coding system is in principle impossible.
Если в вашем телевизоре нету аппаратной
If your television does not have a hardware information coding system, or the television already works on the basis of a certain operating system of informational algorithmic support of operation, there is no algorithmically programmed information coding system, then you will not be able to watch the corresponding channels. This is that which concerns the triunity.
Это вот то, что касается триединства.
This picture is, in fact, also a metaphor.
Это, в общем-то,
It is a matrix of possible states,
это
a
матрица,
certain matrix conditionally presented,
некоторая
but not randomly presented.
представленная. Но она не беспорядочна.
Here is the zero state, first, second, third, fourth, fifth. All this is a plurality of possible states.
Чтобы связать с теорией
In order to connect with the theory of governance, on the left there are placed two scales.
шкала
The scale of the quality of possible states, that is, the quality increases upward, and the scale of the current era of governance,
и
that is, each state in any of the pluralities is characterized by distance from the chronological upper axis.
характеризуется удаленностью от хронологической оси верхней. Ну а качество, как вы знаете, это некая
Well, and quality,
оценка
as is
вектора
known,
ошибки управления. Ну,
this
здесь
is a certain evaluation of the vector of error of governance.
для упрощения. Хотя, может быть,
Well, here the current single measurable error is just for simplicity,
параметры, кроме
although there may be more than one such picture in which other parameters besides y
компоненту
characterize the error of governance as a component of the multidimensional, multi-measurable vector of error of governance.
понять, что есть что. И соотношение вот ошибок
But this should not confuse you, because the main thing is to understand what is what.
когда
And the ratio of errors of governance and quality of governance is such that when the position on the upper chronological axis T is reached, then this is the best state that the object of governance can have.
дальше вот смотрите, есть
And then look here. There are two positions in the zero plurality of states.
состояний, два положения. Они обозначены буковками.
They are designated by the letters A and B, and, in addition,
через
by numbers separated by a colon,
0, двоеточие,
0:1 and 0:2.
множество. Один
And 0 is the number of the plurality,
положение в порядке
1 and 2 is the position in descending order of the current era of governance.
То, что ось хронологическая,
The fact that the axis is chronological, well, this must be understood in the sense that time is a consequence of measure.
периодичность, если есть некая поэтапность, то с нею можно
If there is a certain periodicness, and if there is a certain phasedness,
потому что
then the concept of measure can be connected with it.
идут первое, второе, третье, четвертое и пятое множество.
Here there is a phasedness, because after the zero plurality, there are the first, second, third, fourth and fifth pluralities.
В первом множестве 3, во втором множестве 2, в третьем
Every one of these pluralities contains a number of possible states of objects.
3. И все эти множества
In the first plurality, 3. In the second plurality, 2. In the third, 3 again. In the fourth, 4. In the fifth,
были
3.
нарисованы так, что и из положения B, и из положения А
And all these
в
pluralities
пятом множестве
are connected with each other by some paths of transition.
из
And look, the paths of transition were drawn by us in such a way that both from position B and from position A, in the fifth plurality, you can get to any of the three possible points, 5, 1, 5, 2, 5, 3. But only 5, 3 will be the best variant for the solution of all governorial tasks.
качества процесса управления, всего процесса
Further,
управления.
the method of dynamic programming speaks of an evaluation of the quality of the process of governance,
изображение
the entire process of governance. And according to such an approach, and our interpretation of this picture, one can reach from point A to point 5,3 along different paths, and from point B to point 5,3 one can come along different paths. But all these paths will be different in the quality of governance,
это тот путь,
because the best path,
котором
this is that path in which the area between the trajectory and the chronological axis is the minimum area.
Если мы идем из точки А, то наилучший в смысле
That is, look, if we go from point A,
путь 0,2,
then the best in terms of quality of governance path, this is path 0, 2, 1, 3, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 3.
позволяющий прийти в точку 5,3 из точки А. Это
And the worst path that allows you to come to point 5,3 from point A, this is 0, 2, 1, 2, 2, 1, further 3, 2, 4, 3, and 5, 3.
С точки Б в точку 5,3 тоже можно
From
прийти
point B
разными путями.
to point 5,3, you can also come along different paths, the best way. 0, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, 3, 3, 4, 4, 5, 3.
Б 0,1, 1,1,
The worst path from point B,
3,2,
0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 1, 3, 2,
5.
4, 3, 5, 3.
То есть и объект А,
That
и
is,
объект
both
Б
object A
могут
and object
перейти
B
из
can be transitioned from the initial states to the ideal state.
состояния, но все определяется
But everything is determined by the character of governance in transient processes
процессах и
and by the initial position of each of the objects.
То есть
That is, object B is in conditions initially worse than object A.
чем объект А. Его
Its current error of governance in the zero plurality is higher, and the quality of state is also worse.
тоже хуже. Тем не
Nevertheless,
менее,
it
он
can
может
reach the ideal
прийти
5-3
в
state.
состояние 5,3. Ну, теперь
Well, now
давайте
let's take a look
посмотрим
at the matrix.
в матрицу. Вот объект А
Object A initially has certain advantages over object B. But the realization of this advantage in the sense of a guaranteed arrival at point 53 is not guaranteed for it. But firstly, from the state 02, he can go to state 1-2, then to 2-1, to 3-1, 4-1, 5-1, that is, he will degrade, because the era of governance is current, integral. That is, due to the totality of all pluralities, the era will grow. Object B can also find itself in the 5-1 position by strength of the peculiarities of governance. But the peculiarities of governance may be conditioned by the fact that the subject's governors simply do not see the paths of transition of objects A and B from the initial position to the ideal position 5-3. Why don't they see them? Well, the reasons can be different. The sense of measure is not developed enough to perceive the possibility of transition. The sense of measure is sufficiently developed, but nraviousness is such that the paths of transition are not given in distinction. Although, if you look at the matrix like this, regardless of the subjects of governance, the starting conditions of object A are better than object B. But if we touch upon the subjective questions of the quality of the subject's governors, then if the governor of subject B sees the entire matrix and sees all the paths of transition, then for him, fully realizable is the path 0-1, 1-2, 2-2, 3-3, 4-4, 5-3, and he can realize it. But if the subject who shoulders governance towards object A does not see the paths of transition to point 5-3, by strength of the non-developedness of the sense of measure, or by strength of the fact that his nraviousness is such that this is not given to him in distinction, or by strength of the pervertedness of the intellect as a consequence of his wrong nraviousness, he evaluates the position 5-3 as unacceptable for himself, then he will lead the object A to some other possible point, 5-2, 5-1, as a variant. But situations are possible where he does not at all see the future, beyond, well, let's say, the fourth plurality. Or an even more nightmarish situation where he does not see the future beyond the second plurality. In this case, he can bring the object to point 2-2, and further there will occur an ungovernable breakdown of governance, and here, shown in bold, we have curvilinear trajectories from point 2-2, 3-2 and 2-2, 3-1. They differ in that if you are at the point 3-2, then you can anyway return to the best trajectory. Either through 4-4, you come to 5-3, or you come in a slightly worse way through 4-3, but you will also come to point 5-3. If after the point 2-2 you find yourself at 3-1, then in the best case you can reach the position 5-2, and in the worst case the position 5-1. Here we consider the passage of the point 2-2. In case the depth of the prognosis is insufficient, and the position 5-3 is not visible to the subject governor. But when it comes to the implementation of the process of governance, even if you see 5.3, you must ensure the stability of the flow of the process of governance. That is, at all transitions, the errors of governance must be within the boundaries of an acceptable range, so that breakdowns of governance do not occur. Because breakdowns of governance are possible, well, here the position 1.3 instead of 2.2, you can find yourself in the 2.1 position if you are not able to ensure the required quality of current governance. But from that position, you can return, in a certain way, to the position 5.3 in the end of the day. Well, if the breakdown of governance occurs in the position 2.2, or on the path from 2.2 to 3.3, then you find yourself either in 3.2, and the situation is still correctable, or in the position 3.1, when the situation leads you in the best case to 5.2, in the worst case to 5.1. But we can assume that the worst variants are not shown on this scheme, and possible failures in a position lower than 5.1, which will be simply catastrophic. You see, this scheme here, it is in the materials of the sufficiently general theory of governance, is a finalizing scheme, analogous to the three previous schemes, on which the explanation of what the method of dynamic programming is and how to use it is built. But then such things arise, things connected to understanding the sufficiently general theory of governance, understanding the essence of time, as not an objective, but a subjectively conditioned phenomenon, since quite often the choice of a standard on the basis of which the perception of time is built is subjective, and depending on what standard we choose, that we get. But what is important here is that the matrix contains in itself all the possible states of the objects of governance that we are considering. And it contains in itself them, well, if you want, simultaneously, and if you don't like the word simultaneously, then timelessly. That is, there is no time. And in this sense, if you see the entire path from the initial state to the final, the ideal state, then for you there is no principal difference between the past, present, and future. In the aspect of governance, and in the aspect of understanding governance as processes of the triunity of matter, information, and measure, this means that after you have decided on a path, the path in the matrix is initially empty, or, if you like, unexcited. It begins to fill with a certain matter, energy, as matter in transitional forms from one aggregate state to others, and it acquires this material fullness. After that, the process actually self-realizes. And the task is only to ensure that in the process of self-realization, this fullness of the matrix of energy, matter, and information is not lost. Further from this, entries into governance as such, in the social environment, governance in technology, in the technosphere, as well as entries into what is considered impossible magic. That is, when the subjective impact in some way entails consequences in the objective, common to all of us world.
Управление в технике, в техносфере, ну а также и выходы туда, что
What else
считается
is there?
невозможной магией. То есть, когда субъективно...
Well, in general, the sense of measure, in this case, presented in this scheme, it must be developed enough for you to correctly evaluate your initial state.
Что еще есть?
Because if you reside in the illusion that you are at point 02, but factually you are at point 01, then the path 02, 13, 22, 33, 44, 53, and many other paths that lead from point 02, they are objectively impossible for you. But if you reside in an illusion, you can take governorial actions that are aimed at the transition in the first step from 02 to 13. Factually, you cannot get to 13 because you are in the 01 position. And at best, as a result, you will find yourself in the position 1-2. And in the worst case, you will have a breakdown of governance. And as a result, you will not even get into the position 1-1, but fall somewhere lower along the axis of states of objects in plurality 1. That is, you see, this scheme is really such that on the basis of it, you can factually set out the whole theory of governance and show that the method of dynamic programming is really an algorithmic expression of the entire theory of governance, precisely as the theory built on the basis of the conception of the triunity of matter-information-measure. Well, now let's look at one more picture. Do you recognize it? Actually, this is the same picture, taken from the course of the sufficiently general theory of governance, but tied to the destiny of man. This was not done by us, this was done by someone else from the users of the system, who made his way through the abstractions of the sufficiently general theory of governance, and could interpret this picture in relation to the possibility of man's personal development. So it turns out that from the worst position 01, along several paths, an individual can nevertheless reach the level of a taken-place human. But from the best position 02, another individual can also descend to the level of a bum or a lumpen. So this picture is joyful. In what sense? In the sense that the texts of the sufficiently general theory of governance have not remained fruitless. For some, this will help to really solve the problems of their life. Well, in relation to society, this will help solve the problems of society, humanity as a whole, give globalization the right course, the right directionality, and everything will be fine in the end. At this point, we finish the lectures on the thematics of the sufficiently general theory of governance. Next year, we plan to continue the lectures, but in the applied aspects. That is, the sufficiently general theory of governance as an instrument for the solution of social problems. and the first lectures will be devoted to the thematics that can be conditionally called
которые условно можно назвать
biospheric social economic
социальной
system as an object of
экономической системой
governance.
как объект управления. На этом все. Благодарю за внимание.
That's it.
Спасибо.
Thank you for your attention.
Ну, на вопросы, какие возникнут по этому.
Well, I will answer any questions about this before the start of the next cycle this autumn.
Следующего цикла осенью этого года.
Thank you for your attention. Until next time.